I'm Risa Graff, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Association of Educational Therapists webinar this morning. Before we begin the presentation, I want to share a little information with you about the Association of Educational Therapists, or AET. AET is the National Professional Association for Educational Therapists. AET sets standards for the ethical and professional practice of educational therapy and provides ongoing professional development for its members and the public. AET helps its members and the allied professional community stay up to date about the latest research-based findings in the fields of education, psychology, and neuroscience. AET's annual national conference will take place in the Chicago area in October 2015. The conference theme is the power of collaborative relationships in educational therapy. And the featured speakers are Tina Bryson and George McCloskey. Today, we are delighted to feature Diana Black-Kennedy, a professional level member of the Association of Educational Therapists. Diana holds a postmaster's certificate in educational therapy, a master's degree in elementary education, and a second master's in English literature. In her private practice in Marin County, California, she enjoys working with students with a wide array of learning needs, including those with learning disabilities, as well as the gifted and talented. In addition to her work with students, Diana writes a popular blog about education at mindsparklearning.com. Diana is a consummate storyteller. With sensitivity and humor, her stories today will give us a meaningful glimpse into the thinking and methodology that inspire her work. Please join me in welcoming Diana Black-Kennedy.
Thanks so much, Risa. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to talk to everybody today about adventures in neurodiversity, teach and think like an educational therapist. So today we're going to go through a couple different sections, very quickly look at the old paradigm of education, then what I'm calling the neurodiversity paradigm, and then what neurodiversity looks like in teaching, and then lastly, how to support our parents. So the old paradigm of intelligence was really that intelligence was the product of a normal brain, whatever that is, that it's objective and universal. It is what it is. We all know what it is. There's no change in context. And that it's static. We would call this a fixed mindset if we were using Carol Dweck's term, that you're either born smart or you're not, and that's it. You can't do anything about it. At the same time, learning disabilities was really seen in this old paradigm as sort of a broken version of this normal brain. And that the problem was all located inside the student's brain and that it was objectively there. Again, no context situation. And that it's static, this fixed mindset, you're either born with a learning disability or you're not, and sorry if you are. It was almost as if we could teach the actual center of the bell curve in an actual person with an actual totally normal brain. We'll call him Fred. That if we had Fred in our class, we were set. Everything was fine, and Fred was going to be fine. Of course, here in Marin, we all think everybody's above average, so it's not really Fred, it's the Garrison Keillor mind, right? The above average mind. Everybody is set like that. As long as there's not a learning difficulty, then you're going to be above average. And then some of the research made it sound like if you didn't have a learning disability or anything like that, actually you had sort of this perfect brain that was this ideal brain, sort of the Superman brain, dedicated to truth, justice, and the 99th percentile. But the neurodiversity paradigm that I'm championing today really says intelligence is socially constructed, it's multidimensional, it's plastic, which means we have a growth mindset viewed to it. Learning disorders, in this case, we really want to think of neurodiversity, the differences in how people's brains are wired, as the rule, not the exception. And that these are context specific, and of course that it's plastic, this growth mindset. Okay, what do I mean by socially constructed? Well, in order to answer what's intelligence, what is intelligence made from, you really need to ask yourself what's valued in school and also what's valued in society. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's often a mismatch between the two. In fact, I would say that the old paradigm, the old assumptions really say an ideal brain equals intelligence. Intelligence equals school success. School success equals life success, success in life. But we're finding more and more that this just isn't true in any of the levels. In fact, there was a study done in 2007, high grades do not predict life success. Not only that, they don't even predict success in the first year of college. And an entrepreneur who was very successful explained it this way: good students figure out how the system works so they can excel within the system. Our success, meaning entrepreneurs, especially ones with disabilities, does not come from working within the system, it comes from reinventing the system. Okay, let me stop for a second, if you will indulge me, in a personal story that I think sort of elaborates this point. I was that good student who loved school. Like, my brain was made for school. If you were going to create a situation made for my brain, it would be school. I loved teachers. I loved adults. I wanted to make them happy. I was good at reading. I was good at writing. I was good at analyzing, which still annoys some of my friends when we're watching movies together. I just loved all of that stuff. And I even loved standardized testing, if you can believe that. I thought it was fun. I thought it was great. It didn't hurt that I did well on it. And I did so well in school that all my teachers said, you're going to be, great when you leave school. You're going to do great things. You're going to come back and speak to our school as one of those inspiring alumni who's just shown us what a good education does. Well, I'm not complaining about my life because I'm very happy with where I am, but I have to say I haven't done anything anyone would call great, right? I didn't invent Microsoft. I'm not Steve Jobs. I'm not Nelson Mandela. And I've never been invited back to that school, right? I haven't done anything that's been so phenomenal that they've said, hey, come back and talk to our school. You know who has been invited back to my school is my brother, my twin brother, who hated high school. He didn't do well in high school. He was very social, got solid C's. He didn't start doing well until way after high school. He eventually worked out how to do college. He went to law school, went to Yale, and then is now doing amazing things with a nonprofit group that he started in Alabama. He's doing such amazing things that they've invited him back to the school to talk about how important school was to him, which he, of course, admitted was kind of funny because he hated it, and they weren't so thrilled with him either. So it's interesting that this mismatch between school and life success works in both directions. There are people who are super successful in school, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be successful outside of school. And a lot of the kids we work with who are not so successful in school, who will eventually go on to do amazing things. So what do we mean by intelligence and learning disabilities being multidimensional? Well, let's talk for a second about just general alternatives to unidimensional view of intelligence, and then talk about the neuroscientist view. And then I'm going to tell you a story of a student of mine named Lisa. So the sort of fight back against intelligence equals IQ equals one number, maybe 3 skills, really, I think, started with Stephen Jay Gould in 1981. He wrote The Mismeasure of Man, classic book at this point in time. He was a scientist and a statistician, and he really wanted to look at the very specific science behind IQ tests and look at how poorly done the science was. So he started in 1981 this book, The Mismeasure of Man. Eventually we have Howard Gardner, who is really the first person who said, it's not just one intelligence, it's multiple intelligences. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. Eventually we got Mel Levine's 8 neurodevelopmental constructs. He was really building on the shoulders of Howard Gardner. But he took a more neuropsychological view of it since he was a neuropsychologist. But let's talk about the neuroscientist view. This is based on John Medina's brain rules. And he says, forget 7 or 8 or 11 multiple intelligences. Categories of intelligence may number more than 7 billion, roughly the population of the world. So let me talk to you about my student Lisa, because I think this really shows how complicated the concept of are we smart or not really is. Lisa was a student of mine at a local school, and she had a rare chromosomal abnormality that really kind of made her come across as pretty autistic. So she wouldn't make eye contact, she had trouble remembering people's names, but she had a really personal relationship with all the technology in any given room, so the projector and the computer and the printer. She was also my very best algebra student, which is interesting because here was a girl who was having trouble reading a clock with automaticity and having trouble making change out of dollars with automaticity, and she loved algebra and she did so well in it. It was really a pleasure to teach her. She got solid A's and not with any accommodations. So after a while, she came to my private tutoring situation, and we were continuing to do algebra. And when she first showed up, I thought, you know what, I'm going to introduce her to my husband because I know she has anxiety in new situations and he's going to be hanging out. I don't want him to surprise her. So I said, do you want to meet my husband? And she said, no, where's your printer? Silly me, I should have known. So we came back to my office and I showed her my printer, and she wanted to know what his name was, and meaning what kind of printer was he, and all of this. And I introduced her to the printer and the name and the number and all of that. And then she said, why does he have a whole bunch of stuff in front of him? Because I had put staplers and things. I said, you know, that's because he doesn't have a paper tray, and that's to keep all the paper from flying all over the place when I print. And she said, he probably has a paper tray. And I said, no, I've looked and looked, and he doesn't have a paper tray. I don't know, it just didn't come with one. And she said, well, there's probably a paper tray. And I said, no, really, I'm sure there's no paper tray. Let's get to doing math. So halfway through the math problem, she looked up and said, maybe the paper tray is underneath him. And I said, no, I've looked underneath, I've looked to the side, I've rotated him all around and upside down and looked through the entire thing. There is no paper tray. So after she finished this problem, she said, let's take a break. I said, great, do you want to take a whiteboard break? That was her favorite kind. And she said, no, I want to look for the paper tray. Well, if you've ever dealt with someone with anxiety and on the autism spectrum, you know that there's only one thing to do. I said, okay, go look for it. And I knew she wasn't going to find it, but that she had to look herself to feel better about the fact that it really wasn't there. So she went over there, and within a second, she had found the paper tray. Now, I had owned this printer for 4 years, and I had, honest to goodness, looked for the paper tray over and over and over and over, and she found it within about a second. So I was laughing, and she was pretty amused. And I said, well, you know, in my defense, that little thing where you found the paper tray, I thought was a little thumb holder. And she thought that was really funny. So here's the question. Who's smarter, me or Lisa, right? Is that even an appropriate question? What does that mean? So I think the moral of the story with Lisa is that a diagnosis, chromosomal abnormality or autism or dyslexia, can be really helpful shorthand, right? I can hear it and I can think that probably means this is the pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and I'm going to try these couple of remediations because I know that they're pretty useful for this kind of student. And it can also circumscribe the issue for a student. A lot of kids, especially with dyslexia, feel just stupid. Like, why is it, I'm sorry, here's my cat. Why is it that I can't learn to read? It must mean that I'm stupid. And so finding out that instead of it being global, I'm globally dumb, oh wait, actually I'm just dyslexic, can really make it easier to handle. But we have to learn, or we have to understand and keep reminding ourselves over and over and over as practitioners, just like S.I. Hayakawa said, the map is not the territory. the diagnosis is not the student, and we never know how they're going to surprise us and where the strengths are going to come. So it's important not to be blinded by that just because they have weaknesses. Now, when we talk about intelligence and learning disabilities being plastic, what do we mean by that? Well, if you're like me, when you were in high school biology, you learned that the nerve cells are the only ones that can't regenerate, and if you have damage to the brain, that's it. You're kind of out of luck forever and ever. Well, it turns out scientists have really discovered that the brain is a lot more plastic than we thought it was, that there's a lot of neuroplasticity. In other words, the brain continues to develop dendrites and neural pathways up through the end of life. And Sally Shaywitz is really the first one who came at this from a situation of what does this mean for kids with learning disabilities. So when she did her groundbreaking work on dyslexia, she found that there was a different way that dyslexic brains processed language when they were reading, but that over time, if you had intensive high-quality remediation, the brain actually shifted to processing language while reading, much like neurotypical peers. So it's not a, this is it and you're done. We've known this for a long time, although not in this, we hadn't put it in the context of neurology. The Pygmalion Effect is a classic study that was done in 1968, where the scientists took a group of kids and they randomly assigned 5 or 6 kids to what they called the sort of extremely high potential academic potential group. And what they did was they sort of secretly told the teacher, oh, you know what, these kids have this amazing academic potential. Well, it turned out they had picked the 5 or 6 random kids completely randomly. They weren't unusually gifted, but the teacher thought they were from the very beginning of school. And what these people found was that when teachers expected that certain children would show greater intellectual development, these children did show greater intellectual development. Now, I'm not including this just to say make sure to have high expectations for your kids. We've sort of known about that forever. But to really think of it in terms of neuroplasticity, that these kids grew more intelligent by the end of the year because of how they were treated by their teacher. So this idea that things change, that your brain, that intelligence can change and morph over time and develop based on your own intentions and the outside situation is really important. Carol Dweck summarizes this by saying it's not always those who start out the smartest who end up the smartest. And of course, she focuses on mindset and attitudes and how hard kids work. So what do I mean by neurodiversity is the rule and not the exception? Well, again, we sort of used to think that if you had a brain that was wired differently, that was an abnormality. That was some weird quirk of science, that you were changed from this normal brain that most everybody else had. But really, that's not true. Now, the term neurodiversity was coined by sociologist Judy Singer, who has autism herself. And she wanted to shift from pathologizing differences in the way people think to accepting the fact that brains are just diverse, that there is a diversity of human brains. She's also the one who coined the term neurotypical and further went on to call it neurotypical syndrome, which I love. So really the idea is that these differences in how people think when they think differently, that's not an anomaly. This is the human condition. There is no normal. Now, a great example of this comes again from John Medina's book, Brain Rules, in the section he calls Ojimon the Neurosurgeon. Now, Ojimon is a neurosurgeon who's been a neurosurgeon for years and years and years and years, super well-respected, super experienced. And every time he's about to do neurosurgery with someone, he has to spend 6 hours mapping out exactly in their brains, once the skull has been removed, where the critical function areas are. In other words, he keeps them awake. They don't feel the pain. He touches a thing and says, what does this feel like? What does this feel like? Where do you feel this? Where do you feel this? And he has to map it out. The reason he has to map it out is because he doesn't know where those critical function areas are, because they're literally different for every single person he sees. Now, furthermore, it's not just the human condition, but it's a good thing. This is an article from Wired. Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment? You know, we know that that biodiversity is what's important for survival, that the more things can change, and in a biological way, that's a mutation. The more that there's change in there, the more they can adapt to changing situations. Well, the same thing is true with our brains, with neurodiversity. That's what's going to allow the humans, what has and what will continue to allow humans to adapt to changing niches. So what do we mean by context specific? So again, this is in contrast to thinking that a learning disability just is. It is across the board. Well, you've probably seen this cartoon. It's one of my favorites. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Well, clearly the fish is not a failure just because he can't climb the tree, just like the monkey is not particularly gifted as a creature just in climbing the tree. So it's the context that makes up the learning disability. David Rose, who's a huge proponent of universal design for learning, puts it this way: learning differences are an expression of normal human variation. Learning disabilities are an expression of variation in the environment. And Deborah Weber further explains that all learning disabilities are an outcome of the child-world interaction. It's not just the child, him or herself, it's what happens and what the mismatches are between that child and the world that creates a learning disability. I'll give you another quick example. We already talked about the fact that I was good at school. School was a good niche for me. On the other hand, if you walk me into a building and walk me out and ask me where my car is, I will probably get lost. I cannot find my way out of a paper bag. I have no sense of innate direction. I get completely lost all the time. Luckily, this was not tested in school, so I didn't have an F on any grades, right? This was not important in the niche that I succeeded in. However, a couple thousand years ago, this could have meant that I had become lunch for a saber-toothed tiger, right? Everybody's running away from the saber-toothed tiger, and they all know that you need to turn left in order to get to safety, and I turn right and wonder why suddenly I'm trapped. I actually have no idea how my genes made it this far. Maybe there was some like negotiating with the saber-toothed tiger that I was able to do, or my ancestors were able to do. So, and Dr. Mel Levine points out not only this context, but that school is a very bizarre, particular context. And he says when they grow up, these children, they will be able to practice their brain's specialties. In childhood, they will be evaluated ruthlessly on how they do everything. And I challenge you to think of a job that either you know about or you've had or a friend has had that has the diversity of skills that we require students to do well in school. What job needs you to be excellent at all the different sciences, math, art, reading, writing, history, PE? I mean, there's a huge range, and we want the kids to be able to get A's on all of those. And then finally, context specific. We owe many of the wonders of modern life to innovators who were brilliant in non-neurotypical ways. We've got Einstein, who is probably autistic. We've got Thomas Edison, who was kicked out of school and had to be homeschooled because his teacher said that he was beyond education. Bill Gates dropped out of school. We wouldn't have all of these things. We've got Steve Jobs, we've got Temple Grandin, Whoopi Goldberg. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, way too much. I could spend the entire webinar just talking about this. And without these people, where would we be? And this is really being recognized more and more in the popular culture. These are just a collection, small collection of articles that have been published in the last couple of years. Forbes, ADHD, the entrepreneur's superpower, Scientific America, the advantages of dyslexia, and this journal that runs trippingly off the tongue, Personality and Individual Differences Journal, Uninhibited Imaginations, Creativity in Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Yale Scientific just published The Paradox of Dyslexia, Slow Reading, Fast Thinking. In Bloomberg Business, Why Dyslexics Make Great Entrepreneurs. There's a reason that probably 30%, if I recall correctly, of Fortune 500 CEOs have either dyslexia or ADHD or both. So what does that look like in teaching? We've talked about the paradigm. What does that look like in your teaching, either one-on-one or in a classroom? Well, let's talk for a bit about remediation and accommodation, strength-based versus deficit model, and mental flexibility, which I'm saying is not just for students anymore. So remediation, accommodation. I don't know about you, but every time I suggest accommodation for a student, either the parents or the teacher sometimes will say, but he or she still needs to learn the basics. How can you say that they should start reading books on tape when they still need to learn how to read? Common Core has some issues about this too. Well, it's really important to explain to people that remediation and accommodation are simultaneous parallel paths. They happen at the same time. It's not an either-or choice. And that we simply cannot afford to wait to finish remediation or even to discover that there's a plateau a student hits in order to start putting in accommodations. Now, a lot of teachers, parents, and of course students say, well, that's not fair. Why is the students, why is she getting extra time? Sometimes teachers are worried that this is going to be what will happen. Why does she get extra time? Why does he get to listen to it on tape? Well, when I was a classroom teacher, we all had huge signs in the back of the room that said fair does not mean same. And when they said that, we just point to it. And what I tell students is it's like glasses. If somebody needs glasses, they get glasses. It's not that they don't get them because nobody else gets them or that we give glasses to everybody. You get the glasses that you need. And what's fair is that every student gets their particular needs met, not that everybody gets the exact same thing. So some common accommodations, audiobooks, Learning Ally and Bookshare are both amazing programs that offer free or very inexpensive books. You can get textbooks on audio through both of those programs. Dictation software at this point is super important and super available for kids with dyslexia. You know, these kids who can tell you a 10-minute story with amazing structure and detail and word choice, and then they go to write it and they write, my weekend was fun, I saw dolphins, or whatever it was that they saw. Dictation can totally help us students start working on the vocabulary and the sentence structure and all of those higher order level things before they can actually encode efficiently. The interesting thing is nowadays is a pretty good time to have a learning disability because we've got this technology that's trying to build an accessibility right to it. So this is a screenshot you see of my computer just when I open System Preferences. So open System Preferences on a Mac, you get accessibility as one of the buttons you can push. When you push that, you get this screen that gives you a chance to do voiceover and audio and captions and all sorts of things, spoken and braille descriptions of items on the computer screen. Right? This is all available right now. On your iPhone, you can do on notes. There's a little way to record through Siri, and it's perfect for our kids. They don't need big programs anymore. Multiplication tables are another thing that if a kid can understand the higher order thinking level of algebra, but they had trouble memorizing their multiplication tables, yes, you get a lot of bang for the buck to help them get automatic on those. But before they're automatic on those, give them the multiplication table or the 9-line sheet so that they don't have to be stopped at that level, which is really detail analysis and memorization, in order to go on. And extended time, one of the most inexpensive, Brain dead, of course they should get it. For some reason, some schools still fight against it. Extended time for all sorts of kids with all sorts of learning disabilities can really make a huge difference. Okay, so strength-based versus deficit model. What does this mean? This is part of what neurodiversity looks like in teaching. First of all brains have areas of strengths. Also important, all brains, even gifted ones, have areas of weakness. And as Mel Levine says, it is indeed tragic when a kid has strengths he has no chance to use. This comes from The Guardian. Sorry, my cat's trying to get into the video. This comes from The Guardian about management style, strength-based management style. If we simply focus on improving our weaknesses, we'll only ever get to being mediocre. But if we focus on our strengths, then we can become truly excellent. For adults, it's true. For students, it's true too. I think this is a really wonderful example. This is Casey Stuttered. Sports became my salvation. When I stepped inside the white lines, all my insecurities and fears melted away. He had severe learning disabilities going through all of school. I just needed to let my God-given talent take over. There, my classmates and friends still looked at me as special, only not because I couldn't keep up, but because they were having trouble keeping up with me. And he's the offensive guard of the Houston Texans. And I think it's really important to realize how important it is to students to have that strength and to be able to pursue it. Sometimes we get so caught up on wanting to spend so much time remediating the weaknesses that we forget that they need a place to shine. Okay. Mental flexibility, not just for students anymore. Now, I bet if I asked every single one of you and most teachers across the globe, do you believe in adjusting your teaching to the learning styles of your students and to be flexible? They'd say, of course I do. You have to meet the child where they are. But I think that there are still certain sacred cows that all teachers sort of hold on to is, but not for this. I don't want to be flexible for this piece. And these are just 4 examples and sort of why I'm saying maybe let's be some flexible. Let's bring flexibility to these too. Sit in your seat. I've been a classroom teacher. I know that it can be very distracting to have kids up and down and moving around. I understand why you want everybody sitting in their seat. At least for me, it's less distracting. But for those kids with ADHD or sensory integration issues, this is really disturbing. First of all, it can keep them from actually activating their brain, and the part of their brain that we want activated, the executive functioning part of their brain, needs to be awake in order to be working. And sometimes sitting in their seat, it just goes to sleep along with them. If they can move around, it stays active and they can be functioning at a much higher level. In fact, it just came out a big article in one of the big newspapers, which I can't remember right now, that said, yes, in fact, scientists have just done a big study that says for ADHD children, fidgeting and being able to move actually makes them think better. So it's at this point a no-brainer. Another one, no chewing gum. Again, I understand this. Who wants gum at the bottom of the desks and all over the floor and on people's shoes? It's a big mess. But there are more there are more nerves in the jaw than anywhere else in the entire body, and they go directly to the sort of keeping you awake section of your brain, because babies need to suck before they do anything else, so they're the hardest wired nerves. So kids being able to chew gum perks them up, gets their attention better, gets their executive functioning working better. I have a student who just the other day, I just saw her doing this and she was having trouble focusing, and she looked at me and I looked at her almost exactly at the same time. I said, do you want gum? And she said, do you have gum? And she chewed gum and it was much better. No eating in class. I'm not even sure where this rule comes from, because it's been a rule in every classroom I've ever been in, but frankly, I can't even think of fabulous reasons for this rule. But I can think of good reasons to get rid of this rule. New studies have said that parts of your brain, individual parts of your brain, use their own glucose stores. So in other words, if you're trying to use memory a lot, your memory part of your brain is going to use glucose. And when it's done with the glucose, then your memory goes way down. Same thing for thinking and for processing. Those are the big three that they've studied. And so if you can be eating just an apple or, a pear or watered down Gatorade every 20 minutes or so, a lot of times in the middle of really deep thinking and concentrating, it continues to let you keep going. This is another one, show your work, now, especially for math. Now, for the most part, I love this rule. This was one of my rules. You have to show your work, right? This is good because it switches kids from thinking about product to process. It allows the teacher to see where their thinking is and maybe where the mistakes are. If kids don't show their work, you don't know where they made the mistakes or whether they copied it from somebody. But there are a couple groups of kids for whom this is painful as a rule. One is your ADD kids whose brains really need novelty and hate boredom. It's not just that they don't like boredom, it's their brain is like, no, we can't focus on that. And so to show their work for every single problem becomes really painful. A lot of times with that, I say, show your work for the first time, and as long as your accuracy stays up, then you don't need to show your work again. That also gives them an extra motivation to stay accurate. The other group is kids on the autism spectrum. Wherever they are on the autism spectrum, a lot of times they are so gifted at math because they have this advanced, sophisticated way of imaging the concepts and the ideas. Their imaging is so good. And Temple Grandin talks about this in her book, Thinking in Pictures. But the thing that's really weak for them is being able to connect those pictures over to language, either to make sense of language into pictures or to put pictures into language. And that can be really, really difficult. So if you say, do the work, and it's their strength and they're doing brilliantly, and then you say, now tell me what you just did or how you thought about it, they may not be able to put it into words. And it might be, it's limiting how well they'll do in their area of strength based on their area of weakness. So it's good to be flexible in these certain cases and others that I can't even think of. So really what I'm saying is, for all rules and expectations that you have about kids, if a student is chafing, if it's not broken, why fix it? If a student is chafing, assess the purpose of the rule. How important is it? Why is it important? Is it some way to meet that importance in some other way? And why they're chafing. Now, is it just your normal average, oh, I don't want to show my work because it makes my homework take 5 minutes longer? In that case, I'd ignore it. But if there's a really compelling reason why they're chafing, then it might be that our flexibility is what's being required as the teacher, as the ed therapist. Okay. I want to end with this section on supporting parents, because as educational therapists, as teachers, as people who work with kids with learning disabilities, we're often the frontline responders, the first responders to parents who are facing what is potentially a crisis, which is finding out that their student has a learning disability, or that their learning disability is more extreme than they thought it was, or had wider implications than they thought it did. So what do parents need, and what should we keep in mind? Well, there's grieving the perfect child, the 30,000-foot view. We need to really remind parents that we don't know what the future is going to bring and what parents really can do. So what do I mean by grieving the perfect child? Well, Louis Cozzolino, who's written a couple books about kids with learning disabilities, is a psychologist and professor, says a lot of the work I do as a psychologist is to get parents to let go of the ideal child they imagined and appreciate the child they have. And there's a lot of research on this. Ken Moses talks about all parents must grieve the loss of their idealized baby, that all parents, when they're about to have a child, imagine what it's going to be like, and that there's usually a gap between the reality and the ideal, and that they have to grieve that loss of the ideal. Well, when there's a learning disability, that gap is often much wider, and you might not find out about it until kindergarten, until 3rd grade at some point. And when you find out about it, you're going to go through a grieving process. These parents will. I had as a young teacher without children, had really had trouble empathizing with some of my parents, thinking, why are they in denial? Why are they blah, blah, blah? Wouldn't it help their kid if they just accepted it? And when I heard this, it was that aha moment that really allowed me to bring compassion to the table, which is that grieving the loss of the perfect child is the same stages as grieving a death. That it's non-linear and recurrent. You don't just go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, done, right? And that it comes back again, and that often it's re-triggered at key moments in schooling. When I taught at the special needs school around here, and I taught algebra, that was one of the moments where these parents who were not in denial, they had their kids at a special needs school after years and years of dealing with learning disabilities. But taking algebra and being able to pass it was the key to graduating with a real diploma. And a lot of times, if you were saying to a parent, I don't think they're going to be able to pass this class, what you were saying is they're not going to have an actual diploma. And that was a huge grieving process all over again. So what do parents need in this situation? Well, they need accurate information, and we can really do this for them. They need accurate information about the child. Candy coating, being polite is one thing. Candy coating is totally not what they need right now. The possible outcomes, positive and negative, and the possible treatments for their student. And what I hear and what I feel this is all expressed in is, my child ever going to get over this? Fine, I'll come to you for a year, twice a week, 3 times a week. Will they be done at that point in time? When a parent asks me this, I always use the example of Gavin Newsom, who's here in California. He was the mayor of San Francisco. He's been the lieutenant governor of the state, and he just decided to run for governor of our state. And I think he has very high chances of winning. So I said, look, Gavin Newsom, super successful guy, really dyslexic. He has severe dyslexia. So he has told people that with his dyslexia, he has to get up 2 hours earlier than all of his advisors so he can get the newspapers read, that they're going to read faster than he was. He's also told people that out of the thousands of speeches that he's ever given, he's probably read 2 or 3 of them by actual text. The rest he does extemporaneously, which is just remarkable. But it's dealing with his limitation of dyslexia. So I tell the parents this, and I say, so, has he gotten over dyslexia? Well, he still has it. He still has to get up 2 hours early and deal with making speeches extemporaneously. But has it kept him from being successful? No. So parents also need a way to tell their stories, to talk and process about what's going on for them. They need their feelings validated, including the ambivalent ones. And again, I often felt like I was in the position of defending a child, and having learned that this was really a grief process, it makes sense that you need to give space for the more negative, those are my cats, the more negative feelings that they're having. They also need support and community, probably beyond what we personally can do. So this is when you need that list of support groups, online support groups, physical support groups. There's so much out there for parents, and you need to be ready to give it to them, because you know that they're going to need it, whether they know they're going to need it or not. Parents also need a realistic, multifaceted view of the future. This is what Lee Kravitz and David Feldman in Super Survivors called grounded hope. It's not positive thinking, everything's going to be fine, rosy colored glasses. It's really looking at the truth, the nitty-gritty truth of the matter, even the negative parts, and then saying, well, what can I do? What do I have control over? And I like to think of this as a balance between what Diane Provo, an educational expert around here, says. She says when parents come to her and say, you know, what's going on? How long do I need to deal with this? She says, you know what? Pull up a chair. You're going to be here for a long time. You're going to be at the table helping your kid for a while. This is not a short-term process. On the other hand, they also need that balanced with what I'm calling the 30,000-foot view. So let me talk about what that means in my mind. First of all, let's talk really big picture. No longer nitty gritty, is my child going to pass this test or algebra or high school? Well, what's going to happen long term? Well, what determines happiness? There are people who study happiness. It's happiness studies, positive psychology. Genetics, 50%. Not talking about learning disabilities here, talking about genetics of, are you predisposed to depression, or are you predisposed not to depression, where you're going to be pretty happy-go-lucky no matter what. Your actions and thoughts, how you think about certain situations, your mindset, what you choose to do in a certain situation. 40%, that's a huge amount that is really under our control. That's amazing. And then only 10% external circumstances. 10% of how happy you are is, what school did you go to? Do you have a learning disability? That's an external circumstance. What job did you get? All of those, that's 10% of our happiness. This is really eye-opening, I think, for a lot of parents, especially who are nervous about their kids. There's another long-term study done in the London School of Economics, it turns out, because they're looking at life satisfaction as a better way to judge a country than gross national product. So they've started studying life satisfaction, both adulthood predictors and childhood predictors. And when they went back in their longitudinal study and looked at childhood predictors of life satisfaction, the number one is the child's emotional health. The number two was the child's conduct, their behavior, which I would argue comes mostly from the emotional health. And they say the least powerful predictor is the child's intellectual development. This is also eye-opening. This is totally not the narrative that we usually think of. There's another long-term study that I just love. It's called the Grant Study. It was set up in Harvard starting in 1938, and they picked, I think, 256 or 268 students, all men, because it was Harvard in 1938, that the faculty thought were well-adjusted, normal, good guys, you know, who are doing fine. And they have studied them ever since then. So at this point, it's still going on. These people are in their 80s, in their 90s. Some of them have passed away. They have children, they have grandchildren, they have great-grandchildren. And George Valent, who's been studying this for the last 20 or 30 years, he's been overseeing it recently, has written numerous books. And at this point, he's gotten to their later life. So he's able to look back and do analyses of all of these pieces and how they're doing now. And he says there's a flourishing life. There are 4 or 5 different ways you can flourish in your life: economic and relational and happiness and mental health, all of these ways that you can flourish. And he's looked at what corresponds to making you have a flourishing life. And he says by far the most important influence on a flourishing life is love. And what I found interesting is that how warm these men reported their relationship with their mothers were had more to do with how much they earned than how well they did in school or their IQs. The other thing parents need to be reminded of is we don't know what the future is going to bring. Right? This was explained to me really well by Ann Gordon, who's a psychologist and also a BCET, a board-certified educational therapist. She says, you know, as parents, we can only imagine a future that is based on our own experience, what we know. If our kid doesn't fit into our paradigm of what we know, it's really hard to picture what they're going to do. But the reality of the world is that there is an infinite number of niches and we cannot predict them. In other words, just because we can't picture our child doing well the way we did or we do as adults doesn't mean they're not going to do well. In a world changing, this is back from the Wired magazine, in a world changing faster than ever, honoring and nurturing neurodiversity is civilization's best chance to thrive in an uncertain future. The world is changing faster than ever. Who would have thought years ago that you could be successful designing apps? Who even knew that that was a term, right? That it didn't exist. Or that you could have a career doing cloud infrastructure and architecting for the cloud. One of my brothers does that. I don't even know what it is, but it's something he's successful at that didn't exist when my parents were raising him. They couldn't have thought this is what he's going to do to be successful. So what can parents really do if all this stress about making my kid like me doesn't work? Well, Dr. Mel Levine says parents have a special responsibility and joy as they get to know well and to cultivate their children's individual minds. That's really what we're looking for. What does it mean to know well and to cultivate children's individual minds? And Ann Gordon points out as well, the more we can see them, our children, for who they really are, the more they will have confidence to go forth into this unknown world that we can't predict and do well. And I'm going to end with a story about this girl, Madison Tevlin. She was born, she's has Down syndrome, and she wanted to sing. She wanted to be a singer. And this is particularly difficult for kids with Down syndrome because there's something about Down syndrome that makes it very difficult to push air out of their throats. It's one of the sort of quirks of Down syndrome is how effortful it is to get the same amount of air out of their throats as neurotypical throats. But nonetheless, Grace Tevlin, her mom, decided to get her singing lessons, and they got singing lessons. She's been working on it for a couple of years, and she loves it. And recently, she recorded herself singing a John Legend song, and this went viral. And in fact, John Legend himself retweeted it and showed it to people, which thrilled her to no end. So Today did an article about her. And they asked Grace Tevlin, the mom, what advice would you give to yourself the moment you found out that your child had Down syndrome? And she said, this is what I would say. Love them, love your children unconditionally. They will show you what they've got, and their abilities will shine. I promise. And that's really the core of this neurodiversity paradigm. Thank you.
Diana, thank you so very much. There are a couple groups of questions. The first one is a lot of people would love to have a list of your resources, and people want to know whether you are going to make your slides available, and if not, could you have a resource list that would be available on the AET website? So people want to do some of the research you've done for us.
Yeah, absolutely. The slides will be available on the AET website. I'm not exactly sure where and when, but I did send them in. And if reading the resources in the minuscule little font, I've cited everything in the slides, so you'll have that. But if it's too small, and I'll look and discuss with Nan Freund, who's putting it up on the website, if it seems that I should also put together a bigger fonted list of resources, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. And the rest of the questions fall into the same category, but some have come from parents and some have come from classroom teachers. What is the language that you recommend people use to explain neurodiversity to children so they have an understanding that's very positive about their own brains? And I know it might be different for a teacher speaking to the whole class versus a parent at the dinner table.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things that I would say is everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Absolutely everybody. And I always, when I have this talk with my students, when I was a classroom teacher especially, I would cop to the fact that I have no sense of direction. And I would even say, I still have to do this. I don't know if you can see me. I still have to do this to figure out my left and right. Does that mean I'm stupid? And of course, children are very concerned and caring, and they go, no, don't worry, you're not stupid. So I talk about the fact that there's just different strengths and different weaknesses, that there are little pieces of the brain that sometimes there's a glitch in. That dyslexia is, for instance, just a little piece that's sort of a glitch that makes it difficult to read and write, but there are a lot of strengths that come with dyslexia. The other thing I do, especially with dyslexia, is I'll show with my hands, I'll say, you know, look, you're this smart. And because you're this smart, I would assume that you could read at this level. And the fact that you're reading at this level, that's why I'm concerned. That's basically what dyslexia means, is that you're not learning dyslexia as easily as, or you're not learning reading as easily as we thought you would. based on how smart you were. And then I say, you know, if you just weren't very smart, if you were down here, we wouldn't be worried about this. We would just say, oh, poor little child, you know, isn't going to learn how to read. It's because you're so intelligent that we want to work with you extra to get you up to this. The other thing is there are so many websites and so many examples nowadays of successful people with different learning disabilities. And one of my very favorites at this moment is the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. And one of the things that's great is that they have a ton of success stories, not just the famous people, and they've interviewed them, and they've interviewed them about their strengths and weaknesses, and then they've organized it in categories. So if your child is interested in architecture, you can look at the architects. If they're interested in cooking, you can look at the chefs. And I think that's also very, very useful.
Diana, in your experience, do parents and teachers need to repeat this lesson over and over, or is it a one-shot deal?
I think they definitely need to repeat it. Look, little kids especially, I would say below 5th grade, they have trouble believing this, because to a little kid, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, intelligence means 3 things. How fast did you learn to read? How well do you spell? And how well do you know your math facts? That's it. And they know exactly where they rank for everybody in the classroom. And they probably know exactly where everybody else ranks in the classroom. So you can say, well, there's different levels of intelligence, blah, blah, blah. But every time a kid gets frustrated, they're going to go back to saying, oh, why am I stupid? At least for a long time. And so it's something that needs to come up again and again until they sort of own it. Ben Foss's book, the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan, is another good one for parents to read that talks about this. And he really sees the successful end result not being over dyslexia, but really owning it. And, you know, he says when he was a kid, he hated to mention that he had dyslexia. And he says now his friends tease him that he needs a shirt that says, have I told you I have dyslexia today? Because he's so open about it.
One more thing you might do for us, I know you have an incredible knowledge of children's literature, and perhaps you can add to the reference list a couple books that are really good for parents to read with children to think about neurodiversity. So I know this is one of your strengths. Yeah. Diana, go ahead.
Well, I definitely will. I would say just off the top of my head, the best one is Patricia Polacco's Thank You, Mr. Faulkner, which is just beautiful. I still get teary-eyed when I read through it. And I read it to my class, and my very first time teaching, 3rd grade, I read it to my class, and then I had a conversation with a student that I thought had reading difficulties. So I was talking to her about how we needed to get her tested. And I said, just like Patricia Polacco. And so when she was telling her mom, because there was a language issue, her mom was a Spanish speaker, she said, by the end, she explained the difficulties and why we needed to sign this paper. And then she said to her mom, you know, so I'll probably be a children's book writer. And I just thought that was a wonderful thing for kids to associate with dyslexia.
Well, Diana, that's a wonderful way to wrap up. And I think Amazon is probably going to get a run on Thank You, Mr. Faulkner. We so appreciate your sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. If Diana's talk has inspired you to become an educational therapist, there are master's and postmaster certificate programs offered either online or on campus. The online programs can be accessed from anywhere in the world. Information and links to the specific programs are on the AT website, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, atonline.org. Anyone who is interested in becoming a member of AT is welcome to check out the AT website for types of membership. It is extremely easy to begin as a general member. Thank you all for attending today. We hope you will be back for our next webinar on August 19th. It's entitled, Starting on the Right Foot, Helping Students Embrace the Challenges of a New School Year, with Mary D. Sklar and Susan McCary. And in September, our webinar will be about how ed therapists and teachers can deal with children and adults, students who have mood disorders while we're teaching. We invite you back and we invite you to our website. Thank you.